Welcome back. This photograph demonstrates something we call value contrast. The photograph has emphasis. Our eye goes to the man in the front because of value contrast. Value contrast is the idea that dark things stand out against light backgrounds and light things stand out against dark backgrounds. In this case, we have this man silhouetted and he's very dark against the slightly lighter sky. It's photographed by Sam Abel of Fishermen in Nova Scotia. I really like this photographer. He is a photographer for National Geographic and did some really beautiful photo series. This next photo demonstrates leading lines. Lines are meant to take your eye on a journey, to move your eye somewhere within a work of art. At least that's what one would hope. This one uses converging lines, lines that start far apart and get closer together to move your eye to a point. If you look at this photo, it's looking up through the inside of some sort of tower. The corner struts that hold the tower upright are the main lines that move your eye to the center. You can see them right here. I've used lines to indicate where the eye moves and how it gets to the point of emphasis. It's a photograph by Margaret Burke White. She's an early 20th century photographer and one of the most prominent female photographers in all of the history of photography. This photograph is a photograph called The Heron by Andre Cortez, and it demonstrates the use of framing. Framing is the idea that you have some sort of shape, and that shape is put around a main subject to draw your attention to it. In this case, the white cabinet is right around the man's head, and it draws your attention, focuses your attention right to that point. One thing I'd like you to experiment with on this project is having things at different distances and having some sort of relationship between them. You've known since you were a little kid that as things get farther away, they appear to be smaller and smaller and smaller. You can play around with that photographically to create some really funny situations. This photograph has a very small man standing on the hand of a very large man. Not really, it's just a trick of the camera, but it's done by carefully changing the point of view of the camera and posing your subjects such that they line up to get this interesting relationship. We can also call this relationship a perspective relationship. Rule of thirds. Rule of thirds is an idea that if you cut the picture up into equal parts vertically and horizontally, you get a grid. You want to put the important things in your photograph either along those lines or at the intersections. The grid can also be used to break your composition up into chunks. Let's look at how this photograph by William Klein uses rule of thirds. If you notice, when the grid comes up, the boy on the left, the left vertical grid line goes right down his center. And if you look at the upper left intersection of the top line and left line, that's right where the boy's face and the barrel of the gun appear. This is not an accident. This is pretty intentional. We use rule of thirds to push our main subjects out of the center of the frame to create what some artists would call visual tension. Also, it encourages the viewer's eye to move around a composition more. If you put a main subject right down in the center of the frame, usually it creates a very static composition. We look at the thing that's in the center, and then we're not encouraged to look anywhere else, so you get what I would call wasted space. But if you shove your things off to the side, you can get more of an interesting composition. So we're using rule of thirds in two ways in this. One, by putting the main subject right at one of those intersections. I call that a point of power, those intersections. Also, we're breaking it down into 2/3 and 1/3 composition. The larger boy takes up 2/3 of the frame. The smaller boy takes up approximately 1/3 of the frame horizontally. This next photograph uses rule of thirds to demonstrate something called a 2/3, 1/3 composition. You can use those grid lines to break up big chunks of the picture. In this case, 2/3 of the frame is the rocks in the bottom, 1/3 is the mountains and sky at top. This is not an accident. This is a photograph by Ansel Adams. It's called Mount Williamson Clearing Storm. Many times you're going to find a lot of different visual dynamics in one photo. This photograph uses quite a few to create emphasis. I want you to take a second to pause the video and observe this photo and see if you can determine what visual dynamics you think are being used. Welcome back. So if you look at this photograph, there are quite a few different visual dynamics. First and most prominently, I would say, are the value contrast. The little baby is very light against a very dark background. But the garage door also creates a frame around the baby to do framing. If you look at the edge of the driveway and the line in between the bed of the desert and the mountains, they create leading lines that lead your eye to the garage. This photograph is also broken up into thirds. The right 2/3 in this photograph are going to be background. You're going to be mountains and sky and desert. The left third of this photograph is going to be the house and the garage. So there are several different visual dynamics being used in this photograph. And that's okay, that's going to happen. On your project, I'd like you to try and create exemplars of different visual dynamics. So if we look at that photograph, it's going to be clearly, for example, a 2/3 composition, or very clearly points of power, or very clearly leading lines. But there might be other ones that come into play. You might have several different visual dynamics that come into play. I would say this one is most prominently value contrast. Last thing I'd like to talk about is be aware of how everything lines up in the frame. Backgrounds can be very distracting. This is a photograph by Lee Friedlander, and he used to like playing with this idea that having backgrounds do things and relate to the foreground in silly ways, or maybe even distracting ways that look like they'd be unintentional, but they were actually intentional. In this one, he's got a tree sprouting out of the head of a little girl. This is a photograph that I found online, and you've got a fountain springing up out of the woman's head. Sometimes this can be really silly if you do strange things between foreground and background, but sometimes it can send the wrong message. This one, we've got a woman in the background who looks like she's obviously in pain. Her ears, she needs to stop hearing whatever she's hearing. And in the foreground, you've got a man playing violin, and what it's saying is that his playing is so terrible that she has to cover up her ears in agony. So sometimes it can send the wrong message. And sometimes it can just be visually confusing. In this photograph, the players in the foreground and the fans in the background are all wearing the same colors and all have very similar types of textures, and there's no real visual organization. The men in the foreground, due to the fact that there's no contrast between them and the background, they don't stand out. They actually blend into the background, leaving the eye visually confused, and there's no real emphasis in this photograph. This is going to be a real issue when you're shooting black and white, because you can't rely on color to make things stand out. You're relying only on the lights and darks, the values. So you have to be really aware of trying to make sure that you've got dark things against light backgrounds and light things against dark backgrounds to make them stand out, so you don't get visually confusing photos like this. If you change this into a black and white, it would just be essentially one level of gray. I'm going to leave you here for now, and I'd like you to come back for the third and final installment of these videos to look at some more examples.